Life on Earth today is an obvious phenomenon. We look for life in other galaxies, yet take our own existence for granted. Sure, we may have reasons to assume success among our species because of the recent medical prosperity and habitable conditions in our modern world that assure us survival. But life wasn't always so obvious. Evolution, where it all started, approximately 3.8 billion years ago, when life first came about, namely unicellular bacteria carrying the shape of thread-like prokaryotes. After the prokaryotes came the anaerobic photosynthetic cyanobacteria, which soon came to be an influential part in creating a habitable environment for upcoming species. Cyanobacteria most likely didn't use oxygen during this stage of photosynthesis, since the atmosphere wasn't filled with oxygen at this point. Instead, it's said that they had the abilities to bind nitrogen and sulfur. According to the Swedish National Encyclopedia, between 3 to 2.5 billion years ago, the green cyanobacteria developed from their predecessors and induced oxygen to the atmosphere. For a long period of time, the oxygen created in the photosynthesis was used for oxidation of iron ore. Once oxygen levels increased, the anaerobic cyanobacteria had to withdraw themselves from areas where oxygen occurred. This has in later years been referred to as world's first mass extinction. During this, organisms that survived also developed into two distinct pathways, bacteria and archaea. Archaea became the predecessor of the first eukaryotes, such as algae, shrooms, animals, and plants. The main difference was the nucleus of the eukaryotes. With time, eukaryotes developed more complex structures and became more advanced beings. The first known unicellular eukaryote is the paramecium, which is estimated to have existed 600 million years ago. Another important part in the evolution is when arthropoda developed from the sea and the first complex organisms came to life. These were called trilobites, an extinct marine arthropod, one of the first animals with joints and skeletons. Approximately 475 million years ago, the first plants inhabited Earth, which means that animals indeed occupied land long before plants even existed. 385 million years ago, forests developed from these plants, and so the evolution continued its course, new species developing throughout time. Although life has flourished into thousands of species divided onto hundreds of branches of categories, Darwin's theory states that all life comes from one common ancestor, that one anaerobic cyanobacteria which could recreate itself and multiply into offspring. How did this happen? How could one unicellular organism reproduce and later on become the great ancestor of us all? Well, that's a complex process, but I will try to break it down to you. The first organism alive was, as mentioned, a unicellular anaerobic cyanobacteria that reproduce by mitosis. Mitosis is the basic phenomenon that all living cells have come to do to this day. It is established off of the DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, a molecule that carries information on how the organism should function, develop, and reproduce. DNA can be found inside any nucleus and is passed along to offspring within the chromosome pairs, where 23 chromosomes from each parent are inherited. DNA is built up by smaller molecules called nucleotides that contain three major components: phosphates, sugar groups, and nitrogen bases. The nitrogen bases are complementary to each other in pairs and make up the genetic code, which determines the information about the organism. The 4 nitrogen bases are adenine, which is complementary to thymine, and cytosine, which complements guanine. The phosphates in the sugar group form a double helix, and along with nitrogen bases that complement each other in the shape of a ladder, the information carried gets packed tightly inside the chromosomes. When the cells reproduce in mitosis, the DNA is dependent on enzymes to activate certain processes. An enzyme named helicase separates the 2 different strands of the DNA molecule in a particular order. The molecule is read from the side 5' to 3', which is an important thing to note. In the transcription of the DNA, the strands of 5' is fairly simple to replicate. The enzyme primase will begin placing out nitrogen bases in order, and then another enzyme called DNA polymerase will build on continuously. The strand of 3' on the other hand can only be recreated in parts. First, as in 5', primase will create a primer. A bit away, another primer will be placed, and enzyme ligase will place so-called Okazaki fragments in between the primers. Once the fragments are placed, the enzyme exonuclease will remove the primers and DNA ligase will fill in the gaps with correct nitrogen bases. This process repeats itself when primase places a new primer further back on the strand. For the living cells to develop into larger units and become more advanced beings, the cells need to create protein that build up body parts such as enzymes, muscles, and body tissue. For this to be possible for the organisms, RNA must convert information from the DNA. This process starts in the nucleus, where the RNA copies the DNA and becomes messenger RNA, and later moves out into the cytoplasm, where the messenger RNA moves into the ribosome. Meanwhile, transporter RNA carries the information of which amino acids are to be used. The correct amino acids are used to form a chain of polypeptides, which sooner becomes proteins. The 2 main explanations of the theory of evolution is that all beings derive from one common ancestor and that natural selection affects how evolution turns out. Charles Darwin implies, according to Live Science, who has made a summary of Darwin's own book on the origins of species from 1859. This process explains how certain individuals that are best adapted to their surroundings survive and therefore create most offspring, changing the genetics of a population over time. To understand how this theory works in reality, let's look at an example. In a population where some giraffes have long necks and some have short ones, the giraffes with short necks wouldn't reach the leaves on the trees and therefore wouldn't be able to eat. The giraffes with short necks would die out and not pass on their genes to offspring. Hence, the population would have more giraffes with long necks because they survived. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck also had a theory of how giraffes' necks could have adjusted throughout evolution, which stated that acquired traits could be inherited by the next generation. Neither of the theories have been proved to this day, hence the fact that they are still theories. Lamarck's theory could only scientifically be backed up in specific cases and therefore was rejected by society in the late 20th century, after Gregor Mendel's work on genetic drive and frequency could complement Darwin's work. Why is Darwin's theory still valid when so many others have been opposed, you may ask? Well, his discoveries were not always accepted by the public. The church opposed his finds for decades, since it proved the religion wrong, as God was not the creator of all life in Darwin's theory. Today, the theory of evolution by natural selection is the most fundamental theory and has not yet been proven wrong, but it hasn't been proven right either. There are sources that speak against the theory. Here's a few of them. If several fossil finds were to ever show to be static and proven not to have developed in centuries within their estimated time period of existing on Earth, the theory of evolution would be proven wrong instantly, since the theory manifests how species develop from each other and their needs for different traits adapted to their surroundings. This has yet not been the case, and the evidence for the theory to be incorrect has not occurred. Another flaw in the theory would be if a species share traits specific from two different branches of the phylogenetic tree. An example would be a spider and a human. Their common ancestor didn't have eyes, and both humans and spiders do, but they have developed them separately. If they were dependent on each other to develop eyes, the theory would be false. This is what's called macroevolution and microevolution. The movement of intelligent design states that an undiscovered barrier prevents macroevolution. The leaps between the different species are too great to prove. Therefore, it is impossible for macroevolution to exist, according to IDEA, an Intelligent Design Education Awareness Center. One specific example would be the leap between amphibians and birds. Sure, the slightly empiric view on the theory of evolution, which means that experiences and sense acts as proof for scientific research as well as the creationist method. When facts are found to support a hypothesis, the perspective will be different. According to this view on science, one assumes that the hypothesis, in this case God, created the earth, and facts are found to support this. And with the empirical view, one must have experienced evolution in some way to know for sure. Because of this, the theory of evolution, which does not match with the creationist view, it won't be acknowledged as a fundamental theory. On the other hand, one can't prove intelligent design either, since it has not been experienced by living humans today and will remain a theory because it cannot scientifically be backed up, because there are not enough facts to support it rather than the theory of evolution. I believe that what speaks for the theory should be valued higher, since it has roots in the scientific method and the atomistic view, since it is a more accurate way of gathering facts. In these methods, you look at each piece of the evolution in detail and gather facts and draw a conclusion based off of it, not gather facts that are in favor of your hypothesis. These arguments were all collected by Darwin with help from these methods. The first arguments are the fossil finds gathered from early stages in evolution. Today, there are distinct layers in the sediments, where every layer represents an era in the early history of Earth. One usually divides them into 4 layers. The further down in the sediments, the older the organisms are, and the simpler. This is a direct proof of evolution, since it shows that over time, the living creatures develop more complex structure. An example I will get back to is the trilobites. Trilobites are located in the first layer of sediments and are also claimed to be the oldest living arthropod on Earth, also the simplest. Were trilobites to be found in the more recent eras, the theory would be false, as previously stated. Other evidence for the credibility of this theory is the phylogenetic rule. During the development of the fetus, the individual undergoes its whole evolution from a unicellular organism to a full-grown baby. This refers to the fact that we are similar to other species, fetuses in the womb, but during the pregnancy the baby evolves into the species of its parents. This is because of the fact that we share the same construction of DNA, but during the development of the fetus, the information from the parents affect the baby. This phenomenon is called homologous organs, which is similarities in the DNA that points to linked ancestors. It's usually described as the same structure in the DNA, gives different functions in different organisms. Although evolution by natural selection is simply a theory, because it consists of well-tested hypotheses, it is the most fundamental explanation of our ancestry that we have, and the one that we can explain from the most perspectives. It is based on legitimate facts and observations of our world, and the closest to truth today, although it has some minor flaws or missing information. Theories can change over time when new legitimate facts appear, and there is nothing saying that evolution theory can't change over time as well. But right now, it's what we consider fact, at least the closest thing to it. So there's no need to fix something that isn't broken.